And I'm going to get my notes up.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're live. Today, I'm very happy to have with me author and historian Henry Davis. Henry has written the book Creating Christianity, a weapon of ancient Rome, which asserts that the story of Jesus was created by Roman royals as a way of undermining the Jewish religion and paving the way for a new dynasty of emperors with their own religion to control the masses. At the center of this creation, Henry reveals an individual obscured by history, Arius Calpurnius Piso, to whom Henry attributes most of the credit for writing the New Testament. The twists and turns are many, and the individuals involved are often hard to pinpoint, but with Henry's help, we will take a high-level look at this very specific time in history that has been obscured by time and agenda, and try to unravel a mystery 2,000 years old that has driven the course of countries and kings and been responsible for amazing works of art, architecture, and altruism, as well as wars and violence. Henry, thank you for talking with me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
By way of introduction, I'm going to just kind of explain my own interest in this discussion. Like many people, I was raised in church. I went to theological seminary after high school, but eventually experienced a crisis of faith that led me away from my faith, family, and friends and into the wilderness of skepticism. Over the years, I have continued to look into new revelations regarding the Christian faith, such as the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels in 1945. When I recently discovered the work of Henry Davis, a whole new stack of questions emerged, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we've got a lot to go through, and before we start, though, I think, Henry, just to kind of kick things off, like I said, I went to church and kind of went to Bible school and, at some point had that crisis of faith and went away from what I knew growing up. But I'm curious as to what it is that got you into this interesting discussion.
Well, personally, I've never really been brought up in a religious kind of environment. So for me, it's purely historical fascination. I wanted to formally study ancient history and documents and primary sources. But back when I wanted to do that, I suffered with a lot of anxiety and lack of confidence. So I embarked on, I embarked on trying to teach myself as best I could, knowing that, of course, I was always going to be limited to what I could understand without going through a formal education. So I tried to read the work of popular historians and researchers of this period of time, which helped a great deal. And then as I was doing that, I suppose I had the questions of how Christianity fit in to the time period that I was studying, because I could see how the other religions sort of came about. But for this one, like many researchers have said before me, it appeared to just exist in its own little world. And there were many questions and issues which hadn't been answered by mainstream academia. But when I started to investigate that side of it, I was very careful not to sort of come across the information and sort of study it in a way that was sort of conspiracy-like. I wanted to try and make sure that I kept a very level head and not go down the route of, oh, this is bad, this is wrong, this is what happened, and just be very sober in the investigations, because I mean, in the book, I do touch upon reading the work of Joseph Atwill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I first encountered his book through the documentary he created,
Right.
and only
As
just
did I.
chanced upon that. Yeah, exactly. And I only chanced upon that. Funny enough, when watching YouTube, I was watching a few documentaries about Roman history.
How funny.
And for some reason, I don't know why it came up, but that documentary came up and it looked interesting. I didn't think anything about it at that time, but when I watched it, it made sense to me based on what I'd already researched. But obviously, at that point, I didn't know anything about what's in the book, so it's taken years to kind of bring myself up to speed with the information. But it's purely an historical thing for me. It's not motivated by any kind of attack on religion or anything like that. I'm purely interested in the historical evidence and facts side of it.
Yeah, my where I come into it is kind of getting to where you're at in your mentality, but you know, for 23 years I was heavily steeped in the Christian religion.
Yeah.
And saw it from that perspective, right? From the inside out.
Yeah.
And then now I'm looking at it from the outside in, and I've gone through a similar journey as yours, having looked at Joseph Atwill's research and, you know, several other books as well. It's been fascinating for me over the years to see how new information has come out, and the more that new information has come out, the more that we're getting a clear view of this specific time in history, that if you believe the Atwill theory, or at least, you know, where he starts to point, then there's a very interesting, what I would call, distortion that happens in this time of history. And if you're a Christian, then you're following a certain history, whereas if you're an academic and you're looking at it from that perspective, you're seeing something different. And I think that your book is an example of looking at it from the outside in and not trying to have any specific bias, but just looking at the data and seeing where it points. And where it points is, I would say, both fascinating and disturbing at the same time.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you look at, you know, if you're looking at Piso, Arius Calpurnius Piso, and, you know, if anybody reads the book, then you can get a lot more details on this, but we're going to talk about a fair amount here. But if you look at Piso and you look at what his motivations might have been for doing what he did, then it casts a very dark shadow.
Yeah.
And that's something that, for somebody who grew up in that environment, is disturbing, right?
Yeah.
It's disturbing to think, oh, that's what I was a part of. Because for me, it was, over a period of time, an unshakable feeling that I didn't have the data. I didn't have anything like your book to say, oh, this is what's really going on. All I had was my feeling and the evidence of my own life. Kind of, you know what I mean? It was kind of like, okay, where's all this awesome, you know, Christian stuff that I'm supposed to be getting? You know what I mean? The love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, faithfulness, you know, all those sort of good things, right? And it's not that those are bad things, but it was like a magic wand that I kept on trying to, you know, use, and it just wasn't working the way that I wanted it to. And
you weren't
so
getting anything back from it, from the way you felt.
Not, on a very realistic physical level is kind of, if like it and also in, say, competing in the world, there might be some advantages to being a part of a religion, but there's also some, I would say, intellectual disadvantages, because there's a constant, say, psychological splinter in your mind everywhere you go, and it's this idea of, if you die without Jesus in your heart, you're going to burn in eternal flame, and a lot of different things sort of connected to that, right? So when you go through the effort to try to disconnect yourself from all of that, and also try to make your peace with it and move on from it, it's very helpful to be able to have a discussion like this, and that is my primary motivation for wanting to have this conversation with you, is because I feel like there's a lot of people who are in a similar position to where I was, 20 odd years ago at this point, where they want to get out. They know that they have an unsettled feeling about the situation, but they can't put their finger on it. And this is, I think, a very special book in that when you consider the last 2,000 years of history and how much has been obscured by time, the opportunity that we have to have a conversation like this and to look through this information is quite amazing. And I relish the opportunity to have this discussion with you. So what I want to do is, let's see if we could try to find a good springboard, because there's a lot to talk about. And I'm sure that there are people who are listening on both sides of this topic. You have people who are true believers, and you have people who are complete skeptics. And I hope as much as I can to be sympathetic to both sides. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this point in history and try to unravel something that has been tangled up for the last 2,000 years. So the way that I would best describe it, Henry, is, so there's two histories. There's the history of the Bible. And if you were raised with that, if you believe that, then the Bible presents a certain history. If you're looking at the data that you point out in your book, and others have done similar work as well, what you do is you pull back the veil and you reveal the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. Who is the Wizard of Oz, right? And in this case, you're pointing at a guy named Arius Calpurnius Piso. And this is, if you know anything about Joseph Atwill's work, this is like going down the rabbit hole and then finding another rabbit hole and then going down that rabbit hole.
That kind of describes it quite well, actually. With the many twists and turns that the research takes, is definitely a lot of rabbit holes that you've got to go down to kind of find out who the actual individuals were.
And you really have to understand the context surrounding the situation, the languages, and the culture around those languages. And that, I think, is
you have to understand the motivation as well. For sure. For a claim to be made that the Roman aristocracy or Roman elite wanted to create a new law, which is basically what the Testament is, you'd have to show and understand that they'd have a motive for doing that, because a lot of arguments will be that they didn't need to create a new religion. They could just wipe out any opposition. But I think what people miss is that engaging in war and using the military wasn't free. It cost a lot of money, and if they could figure out a way to change what their opposition fought in a much cheaper way, then they were going to do it. Now, I know I've read that some scholars feel that the Roman aristocracy weren't clued up enough on the Jewish religion to be able to create the scriptures, but that's a logical standpoint when you don't have the information regarding the genealogical connections. So when you understand that the families involved, the Flavians, the Pisos, the Herodians were all related,
yes,
you can gather that, okay, they must have had knowledge of the Jewish scriptures and people to help them. So it wasn't just a Roman family writing Jewish scriptures. They had the aristocracy from Judea, who were their relatives, helping them to compile it. But again, as you say, it's a rabbit hole that you've got to go down to uncover that.
The first thing you have to be willing to do is you have to be willing to take the history of the Bible and essentially throw it out the window. Because so often what I find, like when I was reading your book, is there's just so many times when stuff that you're talking about conflicts with the history that I know, that I was taught. And so there's, various moments as I was reading it where I'm just like, well, wait a second, that's not how it happened. But then I had to stop and take a step back and remember that we're looking at two different histories. And when you're looking at the reasons for why this distortion happened, that's a fascinating study. All the reasons, the whys, like why would Arius, Calpurnius, Piso want to do something like this? What would motivate him to do something like this over a period of time? And that, I think, only reveals itself if you understand the culture, the religions, how they worked, what was at play, the Jewish-Roman War. There's these actual events that happen that we know happened, but it's the events surrounding these events that have been sort of changed, right? And that's what
they've kind of, I would say, they're there. The information is there. It's not given in a way that's obvious. Basically, the information's there. It's just not. It's not been given in the history books as this is what happened. They've told that the historians have told what's happened, but they haven't told it in a forthright way. They've used alternate names for certain individuals, but the only way you understand that is by, obviously, in my case, learning from past historians, and then taking what they've written and what they've said about bogus names, and just making sure that what they say about the changes in letters and the rules of the different languages to create new names, just making sure that is accurate, that we have evidence of that taking place. And when you have evidence of that taking place, then you know that, okay, there's no reason they could not do it for this. So then you kind of push on and say, okay, so this guy, his father is known as this guy, but this historian says that name's fake. Then you kind of analyze the name, and then you connect the dots. So then you can kind of start to see the other history that's buried underneath. So it's the history's there. It's just incredibly difficult to decipher.
Right. And I think it's, when you consider the impact of Christianity and you consider how it has been the driving force of empires, it makes more sense in terms of how it was so successful.
Yeah.
Like that was the sort of one of the questions that I had. Okay, like if it's all bullshit, then why was it so successful? How has it continued to be so successful? And this is one of those soul searching things that I had to do for myself, is, kind of looking at the past 2,000 years of history and seeing what the impact of Christianity has often been. More often than not, the Gospels have been spread at the point of a sword, as opposed to, something that has been benign and just entirely altruistic. Although I do believe that there are people who are like that, who do take it in its best form and are not aware of how this has been a tool that has been used by people in positions of power for the last 2,000 years, and they're playing from a different playbook than the average person who is practicing just as a norm, going to church on Sunday every week kind of thing.
Well, that's the difficulty I face, because in the beginning I wasn't actually. I was debating with myself whether to write the book, because there's two sides to it. As you've just said, there's two sides. You have the sort of the controlling, power-hungry side, the political side, but then on the other hand, you've got people that follow this religion and don't do any harm, and it kind of makes them better people. So it's kind of wrestling with how to kind of present the information in a way that's saying, look, you can still, follow that if it makes you a better person. And I suppose that's kind of why I was very conscious of writing it from an historical point of view, because history is controversial. There's many things in history that have been believed by, historians to not have happened. Troy is one of them. And so I suppose at some point, for something to change, you've kind of got to, present an uncomfortable truth. And like, as long as that truth is backed up by credible evidence from primary sources and not, sort of manipulated. But yeah, it's a difficulty, because I do have people that in my family who are religious, and the nicest people in the world. So that was a battle for me at the start, just kind of whether to write it or not.
Because it's like, just even in doing this podcast, I know that it's going to be controversial, right? Because there's a certain amount of people who, just in the investigation, you're already crossing the line. just in asking questions and sort of like, because that, unfortunately, to some degree is baked into the pie, where doubting itself is, it's a trick of the devil, right?
Right.
That is not my intent. The interesting thing is, for me, it's like Jesus says, the truth will set you free, right? So that to me is kind of a bit of a joke in this, is that it is the pursuit of truth that has led me to ask these questions and to have this conversation with you. So for anybody who might be listening, who this is a sensitive subject, this is about discerning the truth wherever it may lead. And this is
I suppose it's I guess it's about sort of letting go of preconceptions. I think that's a difficult one, because I know it's going to be it's very tough for those who are religious to let go of the preconceptions of how they think
Yes.
this religion began. But I've also encountered it within academia, that there's a lot of academics who are incredibly smart and very sober thinkers, but even then they themselves, they can't seem to get past the preconceptions of a kind of conspiracy of, the royals creating something like this to kind of deceive the masses. They don't like the thought of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the getting past the preconceptions is the hard part, I think.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people who have a default position of they believe that Jesus existed. They just, there's some disagreement on the truth of who he was. And for a certain amount of people, I think they think, oh, he was just a wise teacher. And they exaggerated about the things that he was capable of doing and stuff like that. But what you're pointing at is not that. It's that there was never really a specific individual that, as described in the gospel. There were people that he was based on. Am I correct in that? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
this
again,
is kind of where it kind of gets
it's a
like,
tricky one.
Yeah, you kind of have to know more about, like, if you read the book and you know sort of what Piso was up to and his story, like his life story, and how it dovetails with the information in the Gospels and the information that's in the writing of Josephus and, et cetera, et cetera. Then it's like you've got the Rosetta Stone, right? It starts to make sense. You could see how this connects to this. But just getting to that point, just getting to the point to where you can say, okay, I get it. There was never really a guy named Jesus. The character of Jesus was created, and this is kind of where I feel like there's another interesting discussion to happen. It's like the pieces that went into the pie, like what fascinates me, what's interesting to me is at some point, the amount of information that the Pisos and the Herodians and the Flavians were sifting through and cobbling together and doing it over a period of time. The sophistication that they must have had in terms of their knowledge of other religions, and I think this is kind of what's important to understand in this is Christianity is like this merging of ideas that are found in Judaism, in Greek traditions, which of course are connected to Egyptian traditions, et cetera, et cetera. It is, I would describe it as the Romans attempted to take bits and pieces from all of these different traditions and whip them all together into something that they could call their own.
Yeah, they wanted to create something that was universal. And I guess they wanted to appeal to as many beliefs and as many people as possible. I think that obviously the first intention was to kind of replace obviously the Old Testament law, which was propelling the common people to fight against them.
This is something that Atwill kind of talks about that I thought was interesting, and you allude to it as well, and that was the Roman fascination with the Jewish religion. That there was aspects of there was like Jewish mysticism was becoming very popular, or at this point was very popular. And
I think the majority of people had kind of gone over to the Jewish fault, and I think that's what scared the aristocracy, because obviously I think the soldiers in the Roman army had gone over to Judaism as well. So I think that for their point of view, at the beginning as well as later, they were obviously fearful that, as I say in the book, and as you rightly said, if enough people had gone over to the other side, then they would have been in big trouble. Because then they wouldn't have agreed with what the aristocracy were asking them to do. So they would have rebelled and said, no, I want my freedom, I want my rights. And because obviously, the Roman Empire was a slave empire. It was built on slavery. And that's not a controversial view. That's backed up by evidence.
Right.
And then obviously later on we got Constantine, who sort of brought the religion back from the dead, so to speak. And instead of the magistrate telling people what to do, the Constantine kind of brought it in that God had told you this is your place in life and do as you're told. You'll be fine, just do as you're told and you'll have salvation in heaven and whatnot. But of course it didn't happen overnight, but you could see where he was going with that. It was a political move to kind of gain power, because why wouldn't he? If the aristocracy were in control of this religion, it made a good political sense to bring it back and say, right, this is it.
And the Flavians were like, I'm hoping to kind of clarify some of the details here, but the Flavians, their reason for wanting to create this religion had a lot to do with solidifying their power as the new emperors, right? As a new dynasty that they were trying to establish. That to me, when you look at the end of because I kind of see it as like the end of the Caesarian line ends with Nero, and so the Flavians, their reason, Vespasian's reason for wanting to have a new religion would be about establishing their divinity, their dynasty. But maybe correct me if I'm wrong in that regard.
The way I understand it is that obviously Josephus, we're told that Josephus got the name Flavius because he was adopted by Vespasian after Vespasian sort of went soft on him, so to speak, which from other president examples just is ridiculous.
Right. This is looking at it from the Atwill theory for anybody who's listening, right?
Yeah, well, it's looking at it from the Atwill theory, but it's also looking at it from the other information, which I can understand why, but it's been ignored. The Pisonian information as well. When you look into as I did in a video, the ancestry of Vespasian. When you look into Vespasian's ancestry, he is related through his brother to the Calpurnius Piso family. So because Vespasian is related to the Calpurnius Piso family, we know the Calpurnius Piso family through Aris Piso's mother was a descendant of the Herodian royal family. But we also know that, we don't know, I know, and people can read about it. I got to backtrack sometimes. What's been found out is that Vespasian was a descendant of Herod the Great as well. But of course, the ancient historians wouldn't have wanted that to have been known. Vespasian was a descendant of one of Herod's grandchildren, I think he was. There's a lot of information going around my head. The guy's name in history is Herod of Chalcis, Herod king of Chalcis, but his other name was Herod Polio. Now, from that connection, I won't go through it all on this, is on the video, it is in the book as well. from that connection, using the techniques that they did use of like sort of exchanging letters. For instance, I and A could be exchanged as we get in Miriam and Mariam. They obscured the genealogical connection by changing letters and basically just hiding information. It's all scattered around. But when it pulls together, you realize that it couldn't have happened any other way. So Vespasian's motivation for becoming emperor and supporting the authorship of the creation of the New Testament would have been a kind of mutual family motivation, because they all had a connection to the Herodian family, who were being overtaken by the Pharisees, which they were against because they didn't want to stop the institution of slavery and they didn't want a more democratic government. They wanted to keep their lifestyle. So there was a mutual want to stop it. So yeah.
Well, so what I'm going to do here is like, just for anybody, just to give some context here.
Yeah.
So in this period of time, what you have is these different people who are in charge, and we know a certain amount of these people from the Bible. However, there are a lot of names in the Bible that have been fabricated, the New Testament specifically. And we can understand where this narrative takes place in time because of where the story is set, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the history that most people are kind of pulling from, is they're pulling from this fabricated history through essentially 0 AD, the birth of Christ, up until like about, I mean, it's really up until like Constantine. There's just a certain amount of fudgery going on, right?
Yeah, it's a long period.
Yeah, and trying to understand what was happening during this time. There's certain tent poles that you can kind of, in your mind, that you can kind of grab on, especially if you understand the narrative in the Bible, the New Testament. However, there are certain things that you just have to kind of throw out the window, because unless you understand the agenda of the people who were writing the Gospels and what was going on at the time, then it's all very like, it's a riddle, right? It's just riddles within riddles within riddles. And one thing I would say, Henry, is that a certain amount of this information is very difficult to understand when you're dealing with it in English, I find. Because like, for example, I'll use the name Jesus, right? The name Jesus is an anglicized version of the original name, which is, I'll pronounce it Jesus.
That's pretty much how you pronounce it.
Jesus, or there's however, it kind of sounds more like in Spanish, Jesus, right? Because it wasn't JESUS, it's more like IESOUS.
It's kind of like Joshua or Yeshua kind
right
of thing.
But then it's the
different
Greek variation of it, right? But this is where, if you understand about the Pisos and the Herodians, and you understand the information that they were sitting on as aristocrats, what I think is interesting in this is the sophistication of understanding. Because they do understand numerology, they understand astrology, they understand Egyptian traditions, Greek traditions, Judaism. There's a very deep understanding of different things that is obviously that they're pulling from in order to be able to bring all of this information together in the way that they do. And it's in order to understand how they were able to create the story of Jesus, and why I think it has been so powerful over the years, is because the Jesus story does pull from so many different traditions. If you know ancient mythology, if you know things about Horus, and you know things about Dionysus, and the kind of different stories, and you kind of see how these things fit into Christianity, and what Christianity was trying to do was trying to take these traditions and kind of repackage them, right? So one of the early first things that you kind of see is you see an attempt with Christianity to change some of these temples, right? To transform some of these pagan temples and turn them into Christian temples.
They're basically transforming.
There's something that's been I wanted to bring up to you. I very recently read this book, The Immortality Key by Brian Muraresku. Are you familiar with it at all?
No, I have to say I'm not. I'll have a look at it.
Well, I'm gonna bring up something in your book that connects with something in his book that I thought was very interesting, because basically what he does in that book is he just focuses on the sacrament part of the Christian religion, and how it was how it heavily borrowed from Dionysian traditions. The worship of Dionysus or Bacchus, he goes into deep detail about what the worship of Dionysus was all about, and that it was heavily focused in pharmacology, and that early Christian sacraments were using spiked wine. That they weren't using just wine, that they were using wine with psychedelics in it. And
that makes sense.
So I've been trying to kind of put your book together with kind of what he's talking about. And one of the things that stood out to me in your book was when you talk about the name that Piso died and was buried with, and that he was buried with the name Bassus.
Quadratus Bassus, I think it was.
Yeah. And you make a connection between that and Dionysus, that he perceived himself as being Dionysus, or being connected to Dionysus in some form or fashion.
It seems to be the case. Yeah, it seems to be. He looks to have saw himself as multiple gods. That's what it seemed like. Obviously, that's what Roman emperors considered themselves gods anyway. Again, that's not a controversial view. So yeah, I mean, the guy Arius Piso, he does seem to have associated himself with many gods when it suited him for a particular message, I guess is the right explanation, or a particular alias name. I mean, he had so many alias names. I mean, they must have written them down. I mean, how they could remember all those names, I don't know. But yeah, I'm just trying to kind of look up, because it's been a long time since I've researched that particular part.
I have it written down here, so let me see if I can find it really quick. So what he talks about in his book is here we go. The name Bassus may have been used because he saw himself as Bacchus or Dionysius, the god of the vine. As in Acts, Jesus says he is the true vine and his father is the vine dresser. So in his book, The Immortality Key, what Brian talks about is before Christianity, the Dionysian sacrament was very similar to the Christian sacrament. It's almost the same thing. Basically, the only thing they really do is they change the imagery. And what he talks about is he talks about this ancient religion called Eleusis, and that it was all based on Dionysian sacraments, and that it was essentially that they would drink spiked wine, and they would trip, and that it was like these, let's say, guided trips, like you went to your local temple and you had, the local temple of Dionysus, and you tripped and you had a vision of the gods. Now, what I think is interesting is, to me, it seems like it's like these guided trips, right? It's like you're tripping balls, but then you got some dude next to you who's telling you the god Dionysus is coming. Can you feel him? And so I kind of see the same thing happening with Christianity. I see the early services, or whatever you might call them, was they were tripping to this new god that they had created. They had created this this idea of the Son of God, and so and it was all just borrowing from previous traditions, right? So what he's kind of is, just to put a period on it, basically what he's saying is that the early Christian traditions were heavily steeped in the use of psychedelics, and that was a part of the wine, the blood and the body of Christ. The blood of Christ was this Dionysian wine. It was wine that was spiked with psychedelics, and then they would have visions of Christ or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, we know that there was obviously temple oracles that people went to see, and they sat over vapors, and they breathed in the vapors and had their quote unquote vision. And then, I mean, if that is the case with what you've just said, if they did drink and they were drugged, I mean, I'm not going to say that's what happened, but I can see it definitely happening. And then double that with them being read to, because they wouldn't have read the scriptures themselves. So if they were drugged and then read to over, say a period of time, I could imagine them, slowly coming around to the new law or religion. But with that understanding, we've got to be careful, because we know that obviously they created churches in Asia, like Antioch and Ephesus, places like that, which were obviously known for brothels and prostitution and vice. And so we learn about what the churches were because of the New Testament. It actually tells us. And interestingly enough, which I've got to do a little bit more, or a lot more investigation into, is that the travels of Pliny the Younger parallel the travels of Paul. So I've got to do a bit more research into that.
Quick question about Pliny. Was the original name Plinios?
Gaius Plinius Secundus, yeah.
Okay, and Pliny is just kind of an anglicized.
It's pretty much just a translated name for it. Okay. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
that's kind of what I mean. There's some things that they're somewhat confusing because they get translated in English, and then it's like it gets muddled that much more, and you're kind of like Pliny the Younger seems like such a like something out of the Canterbury Tales or something, like, I don't know, you know what I mean? So it's a little, so the fact that his name was Plinios, I'm like, oh, that makes more sense.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, going back to people converting through hallucinogenics, we have to be careful that we read that there was trouble with the churches in Asia. And
right,
you know, you can
because they were getting
conclude
drunk on the wine, right?
No, I believe I've got a video coming out soon about Constantine, and part of it includes why the church was dead, in a sense, until Constantine started to revive it, because the churches were in Asia, and then, from what I believe, again based on the evidence, is that they were using people weren't converting to the religion. It wasn't becoming successful, so they used what had been used in the Jewish temple and in other places. But they basically use like temple prostitution, and there's evidence of this by numerous past scholars, of little chambers where you would go and, you know, join. Basically, there's various words for it. So they join up and they'd, you know, do the deed, or, you know, as a religious sexual ritual. So what there apparently there's archaeological evidence from the early churches that there was small chambers built into the converted churches that so-called Paul was making, and they were resorting to sex, basically, to get people in. And the evidence for that is that there's actual, like you've said, multiple layers within the New Testament. So on one layer, you kind of, I don't know, have a passage saying, you know, she covered my feet with fluid, etc., etc. But when you realize that feet and hands in those passages are euphemisms for the phallus, the penis, then you read it in a completely different way.
Right.
And we know that the feet and the hands were synonymous with the penis and the vagina. So you can't really get away from it, because you know that that's a part of it.
Right.
So
this kind of goes back into, there's a certain amount that would make a lot more sense if you lived in the time and were familiar with this again, and it's where things get that much more obscured when you get to the English translation, later translations of the Bible, because now so much more of the meaning gets that much more obscured.
Exactly.
But its ultimate intent, which is used to pacify the masses, it's still being used for that, right? I
mean, I guess it's kind of it got easier, didn't it? I mean, you have like sort of Luther that translated the Bible,
right.
Because the people couldn't understand the Latin, and he wanted people to be able to have a personal touch with the Word of God.
Yes.
And that became controversial because the church no longer had control of the Word of God, and the printing press came in. I mean, if you think about it in a way that the church leaders were trying to spread the word of God to as many people as they could, it makes no sense that they didn't like that the printing press was invented and it could produce Bibles.
Sure.
You know, you'd be thinking, well, you know, I can spread the word of God to many people. Oh, no, don't do that. we don't want people knowing what's actually in there.
And yet, ironically, it has continued to be successful, but it's just transformed, right? It's morphed into something different, right? That's what Martin Luther did, and then it's interesting. You know, that's kind of. I was raised Protestant, Pentecostal.
Okay.
There's so many different variations of Christianity. But the one that I was specifically raised in, I mean, it's just, I think about it now and it's sort of surreal how baked in Christianity is with Americana. And it's something that growing up in California, churches are still thriving, right? Christianity is still thriving, but it's thriving in this sort of new form. Now, things have changed, though. Having said what I just said, things have changed, and the reason I say that is, we were talking before about like the grassroots people who they altruistically approach this. They don't have bad intentions. They use it as something because it makes them feel good and whatever. But in the last few years, the impact of Christianity has become that much more noticeable, I think, because of everything that's happened in the States with Trump and the GOP and everything. And for me, that was a significant part of my awakening, you might say. I moved away from the church a long time before that ever happened. I'm living in Canada now, but it's one of these things for me. I had pushed myself far enough away from my connections to the church to that when everything that happened with Trump went down, I could really see in real time how Christianity and the Gospels are used by people in power to manipulate them.
I mean, like you say, it's been going on for centuries.
Right. And the person of Trump, to me, him, like just that moment, right, where he's holding the Bible up in front of the church, to me, it's just the perfect example of how power uses just that iconography, right? He has no interest in the Bible whatsoever. You know what I mean? Like, he's not a moral man himself, but he understands that he can use the Bible as a way of
he's a great
manipulating people. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know much, obviously, about him, but from what I've, especially when he was in office, over obviously based in the UK, we saw some footage of his rallies and speeches, and I mean, over here, I mean, we didn't really take him seriously, I don't think. None of my friends did. I'm not really any political side or anything to do with the US, because it's not my country. Right. But I could tell that he was a good manipulator for those that were easily manipulated. For those that weren't, you could see it in the papers, on social media, that they just thought he was just insane. And that's, it's weird. It's like sort of a clash of I don't want to say intelligence, but a clash of ideology, I suppose.
Sure. It's a little bit of both.
But
I saw it unravel in real time, and it was something that for me was kind of just surreal over the days and months to kind of see everything happening, because it really showed me how easy it would have been for me if I was a young kid growing up in this environment to be waving the MAGA flag, I'm well past that at this point, but I was able to see it. One of the things that happened that really showed me the kind of individual he was he went to a very prominent Christian speaker, psychologist, is a guy named Dr. James Dobson, who a very popular radio show for many years, et cetera, et cetera. And Trump went to this guy and accepted Jesus into his heart. And I doing the bunny ears quotes here for anybody who's watching or listening, rather, because I saw it for what it was, and it was just political maneuvering. You know what I mean? And I was like, okay, is this really? Am I really seeing what I think I'm seeing? Does this guy really think that he can hoodwink the entire Christian community into thinking that he's actually a Christian? I mean, this is the Celebrity Apprentice guy, for Pete's sake, right?
I did watch a few of them.
He was able to do it. That's what was crazy. Like, I'm like, wait a second, he's actually doing it. People are actually believing his bullshit.
Yeah.
And I could see it happening, unfolding, and then the more that it got to the point to where it was just like he could say anything. and
Yeah.
people just looked the other way.
Well, it's just, I mean, what you just said about people believing that Trump was actually a Christian. You know, I don't mean to interrupt, but it reminds me of Emperor Constantine when he had his supposed vision.
Exactly.
And then,
man, I thought the same thing, man.
Yeah, and then it's kind of, I mean, like sort of I mean, I only say it because obviously I'm just finishing off the video at the moment. It should be up soon. But I can't understand why very, very clued on people, with formal educations in history and researching history, and they're not stupid, but they look at Constantine's conversion as being legitimate, as really believing in Christ, and it's like, well,
right,
I can see where they're coming from, but then
right,
I can see the political side, and it's like the only evidence, or the only kind of I suppose narrative that were told that Constantine turned over to Christianity was through a vision, and it's like,
right,
really?
right.
I mean,
exactly.
I mean, for me, it's that the vision was just to convince a story.
Yeah. 100%.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I can't understand why people don't kind of see it as that. I mean, I'm not telling people what to think, but like politically.
I strangely enough, I think it has something to do with sports.
Okay.
I know this sounds weird, but I think it has something to do with like sports and your own team, like, you know what I mean, and cheering for your own team and feeling like you're on the winning team. Right. So when Constantine shows up and he's like, hey guys, I've got a new mascot. We're all going to be wearing these really cool uniforms, and we got this like cool cross, and and then we're all going to be going out and fighting for the empire in the name of Christ, right? And everybody's like, right on, yeah, this is cool. Yeah, no, I like this, right? It's, you know what I mean? There's like something, there's something about it. It's like, when you look at the Crusaders, you know what I mean? It's almost like rugby players ready to go out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you got a part of that, and I think that can be, say, related on the I would say commoner level at that time. So if everyone else is kind of doing it, then commoners will say okay, because there was like a lot of trouble before Constantine came in, like wars and etc. But Constantine won many battles, and he also he adopted the Sol Invictus god as his kind of like protector, or going with the emperor. It's on his coins. He had like Mars and Jupiter on his coins as well, but the main one particularly was Sol Invictus, and is a sun god. So but when you kind of so you can kind of see him taking the sun god, and then it's not a big jump to son of God, and him being in control of the religion, which he made himself in control of it. Obviously, like people say that he made it the official religion, but it wasn't him. It's Theodosius. But that's a good starting point for that. But then, obviously, if you're into the subject and you're researching more, like I said earlier, and you trace his ancestry back, he was related to Vespasian's family, and he was also related to the Copernicus Piso's family. So when you have that connection as well, you can see him thinking he's in a position now, or when he was, to think, right, okay, I have this scripture, because they would have had copies of the scripture somewhere. I have this scripture, and I'm going to unite the pagan religions, the disparate pagan religions, and unite it under one religion. And you can see his motive for doing that. I mean, I could see the political motive for doing that. If it was a religion that you could control, why wouldn't you attempt to do it?
Right. Well, it makes sense. Like when you think of paganism, polytheism, and monotheism, and you kind of see the idea of the emperor, the whole crux of the conflict with the Jewish people was they wanted them to worship the emperor, and the Jewish people were very resistant to it, right?
Yeah.
So by essentially creating this sort of God that, okay, you can worship this God, and we've created a God for you that you can worship, that you should, but essentially while you're worshiping that God, you're really worshiping us. You're really worshiping the emperor, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's what we see very much so with Constantine. The attempt happened.
Well, he made himself the leader of the church, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Basically.
Was he the Pope? Was he considered a Pope?
I believe he was, yeah. I got the information written down. Yeah, I believe he was.
Yeah, I really would like, part of what I'm kind of going for here is I almost want to visualize this in my mind as though it was like an amazing television series where you're watching the life of Arius, and you're seeing the different things that he kind of goes through and how that eventually gets him to the point to where he creates this Josephus character, and he creates this Jesus character, and he is creating all of these characters and writing under all these different aliases and everything. It's really quite mad when you think about it. It's amazing to some degree, but if you could see that, and you could see, what I would like to see is the gospel, the Q document first being written, and what did that look like? What did it look like before the different details were added later on? And
well, I think the Q document from evidence was merely, well, I say merely, I think it was a letter, because obviously we have the connection between Seneca's writing and the New Testament, and there's a letter from Lucilius, which is basically another variation of the name Lucius, writing to his friend Seneca, or a new book by Lucius, I think it's called. And when you read what Seneca says about it, you can tell that it's kind of the beginnings of like a rough draft copy of the first kind of gospel, the tone of it. That's what I read into it. I think one thing that confused me, or a question that I had when I was looking at this was, wasn't the gospel story, like if you look at the Atwill theory, wasn't the gospel story basically like a code for the military campaign of the Flavians when they destroyed, you know what I mean? Yeah. So I guess it's like what? So I guess just my curiosity would be what did that original document look like? Like essentially, it was the prototype for Mark, essentially, right? Yeah. And then at some point, that Mark came in, and all the extra details were added. So I guess the question I'm answering my own question in that at some point when Mark was finalized, the extra details came through in terms of creating this perception of a prophecy and the prophecies of Jesus that match with the military campaign of the Flavians. Am I getting this right? Yeah, that's you pretty much hit the nail on the head. So then with the Flavian, I mean, what the trouble, I think with Joseph Atwill's book, I believe he didn't go further than the parallels. He delved a little bit into the meanings behind certain words, for instance, pierce the bowels kind of thing, with the Mary killing her child, or eating her child. But what Atwill doesn't seem to have done is gone more into the kind of the nomenclature process of what was happening in terms of the names and the what's the right word for it? The kind of the alteration of the names from ancestor worship, which is what the Romans did. They took names from their ancestors and made different names. So with the Jesus parallels with the Flavian campaign in Judea, we from the evidence we know that this individual Arius was there for part of it. I believe he was there at the beginning, and then I believe he was the one who was called Cestius Gallus. It might have been under a different alias name, but he took money from the temple.
In what capacity would he have been there?
He would have probably been procurator, I think he was. He would probably also been a general as well for the Roman army. Because
as a procurator, was that like essentially he was stationed there? He was stationed.
Yeah, it was kind of like an overseer of an area of the
Syria, and then once the Flavians came rolling in, he joined them, I imagine.
Yeah, so
something of the sort.
So when the trouble started, and the Pisos and the Herodians and Flavians decided that something needed to be done, they obviously started to work on the New Testament, and I think because they wanted to quell the rebellion, but Nero, he seems to have not wanted to do anything about it. He seems to have been sympathetic to their cause, because Nero wasn't he wasn't a fighter. He was a creative person.
Right.
So in the Gospels, we can see the evidence that it looks like they writ the Gospels as acts and scenes to appeal to Nero. So it looks like they would have taken that to Nero to get his permission to carry it on.
Interesting.
And something is either Nero didn't want to do it, he was against it, or his wife Poppia may have been against it.
And then later they were able to convince Vespasian. Is that essentially what you're pointing at?
Yeah, in a way. Again, it comes back to Nero said no, and it looks like they carried on creating the scriptures behind Nero's back anyway. Right. And then there was the Pisonian conspiracy.
Right.
To
they were exiled, and
they were exiled. And one of the people recorded in history as being exiled was I may be saying this wrong, Assasinus Paetus, and that's a name that the Pisos used. Now, Assasinus Paetus was exiled to Syria to act as governor, and while he was there, we hear a little bit about him in one part of Josephus, quote unquote Josephus. And then Arius writes as Josephus, and he puts himself in as different names. One of them being Cestius Gallus, goes to the temple, takes money from the temple, and then I believe he incites like a riot. And then I believe Nero exiled him again to Pannonia, which is like the other side of Italy, so far away from Syria. And then I believe that because the Pharisees and the people were getting out of control, Nero had to do something, I guess. And so then he entrusted Emperor Vespasian, who we're told was a beekeeper at this point, to go to Syria and put down the revolt. Now, I would have thought the reason why Nero did that was because he didn't see any danger in getting Vespasian involved. Obviously, there was.
This was not many
Yeah.
years before, but years before Vespasian would actually become emperor, right?
Yeah, he wouldn't become emperor until partway through the campaign, because he left for Rome and then left his son Titus in charge to bring down to complete this siege on Judea. But what we're told is that Vespasian's rise to become emperor was because he had the support of the army. Now, that is most likely true. He probably was a good general, because the royals were taught how to be generals. They were taught about warfare and tactics. But what they weren't told, from what I can gather, is that he was of royal blood. So it wasn't a commoner coming in and getting the army behind him and then taking the throne. It was a royal being portrayed as a commoner, because the soldiers wouldn't have known he was a royal. So he was portrayed as a commoner. The soldiers seem to have got behind him, and then, as we said, the rest is history, or whitewashed history.
Right.
Yeah.
This is for anybody who is not entirely familiar with the history that we're talking about here. What is very significant about this is we're talking about a moment in time when the Romans essentially obliterated the Jewish nation. And for anybody who doesn't understand sort of some of the context of what's going on right now with Israel and Palestine and all that kind of stuff, a lot of the details actually point back to this moment in time. This is a moment in time where Rome goes into Jerusalem and destroys the temple. And that temple, to this day, if you go to Jerusalem, it's still there, and that's where the Wailing Wall is, and that's where devout Jews will go and pray. And from that point, 70 CE, right? Is that? Yeah. Up until
I use 70 CE.
Okay. I know for me, like, just that right there, trying to get used to not saying BC and AD, but CE and BCE.
You could say, I just say it for personal preference. I mean, it doesn't make a difference really.
There's not because I almost feel like there's some difference in I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole. But it's just an example, though. It's an example of sort of this like academia versus religious history, right? Most people who were raised with Christian religious history usually define everything as BC AD, and if you are looking at things from a purely academic perspective, then you're probably going to say CE BCE. And that was just something that I needed to wrap my head around at some point. But let's see, I lost my point. What was I talking about before that? What we were talking about, the destruction of the destruction of the temple and everything. So this is one of the reasons why it's become that much more interesting to kind of look at this. It's looking at this specific time in history and answering a lot of questions in terms like, where does so much anti-Semitism come from, and how did this horrible thing happen to the Jewish nation, and how does all of that history sort of feed into what is happening over there right now? And I mean, when you kind of think about how Israel was made a nation back again, what was it, 69, I think it was, or 49, something like that. This is one of the reasons why I have an interest in this, because devout Christians will point to that as being an indication of a prophecy fulfilled. They believe that Jesus will come back once Israel becomes a nation again. So there's little things in Christianity, popular Christianity, that are popularly believed, and a lot of it feeds into things like the Left Behind series, you know, the belief in the rapture and the Antichrist and kind of all of these things. And it's quite amazing to see how much has come from what was originally written in the Gospels and in the letters of Paul and then into the book of Revelation, and how it has had a huge impact on what people believe. And just to put a point on this, and what I'm sort of seeing is like self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. Where when you have enough people who believe something, they can actually make things happen. And is one of the downsides I see of fundamental Christianity is this belief that the earth is doomed to destruction and that there's nothing we can really do about it. And at some point, Jesus is going to come back and clean up the mess.
Well, I suppose if scientists are correct, then the earth is doomed for destruction if the sun expands. But,
yeah, sure. Yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen for a couple billion years, right?
Billion years, I want to have the next deal.
But it is sort of interesting from that perspective when you kind of look at, just even if you aren't looking at the chaos described in the book of Revelation, you just consider what we as human beings have gone through, you know, through ice ages and different extinction level events that have happened. The book of Revelation is, in some degree, is sort of like almost like a horror story of all of that stuff happening, right?
Well, I mean, I think the reason, based on the evidence, the reason why the book of Revelation appears to be a horror story is because the individual wrote it because he was basically he was pissed off.
Right. The son of Piso, right?
His name in the historical record appears as Julius Severus or Julius Servianus, and he was the brother-in-law of Emperor Hadrian. And so his story briefly was that he'd been loyal. He'd been a loyal soldier. It appears he didn't want any part of it. He appears to be a good guy because the books that he writes, the books of John, they're like the shortest books, and there's some attacks against I can't remember the individual's name now. Is a made up name. I think it's attacks against his father being arrogant, and so they're the shortest books, and then he appears to have been given permission to kind of write the end of the book. And in Revelation, it looks like he starts writing it, and then in Revelation he's got a title, "They will walk upon Jerusalem 144 years or whatever it is, 144 months I think it is, which turns out to be like sort of 3 years, which is the exact period that the what is it, the next Jewish revolt lasted, that he put down, not the Masada one. It's gone out of my head now.
Hasmonean?
No, it's the sorry, my brain has gone froze.
No, this after the destruction of the temple?
This was after, yeah.
Okay.
It was when just trying to find it now. I should know it off by heart, but it was where is it? I'll think about it in a minute. Basically, Julius put down another revolt, and he'd done his job. And in the historical record, it seems like Hadrian was going to make him or his son or grandson the next emperor, because it looks like by this time Julius was around 90 years old. He may have been a little bit younger, and so when Hadrian agreed to let Julius's son or grandson become emperor, it must have seemed like everything was fine. He was getting his reward for being a loyal soldier and being loyal to the family for writing some books. But then something that's not understood or hasn't been answered in academia is that Hadrian suddenly changed his mind for no reason. On the surface of it, academics don't know the reason for it, and instead he appointed Antoninus Pius, the next heir to the throne. And now it's very, we can accept why academia doesn't understand why Hadrian changed his mind, but when you have
Maybe
this
he just didn't like him.
Probably, yes.
He's just like, I don't want you to do it.
It was probably a bit of that. I know that we know that Julius Severus's or Servianus or Julius Piso's brother and sister were still alive, because his sister married Emperor Trajan's Claudia Phoebe, or Poppaea Plotina, I think her name is as well, and his brother was still alive, who was called Justus. And I think he is called Annius in the historical record. Now they seem to have been more in favor of the Christian creation, and so I feel that they may have had a hand in convincing Hadrian not to let Julius's sons or grandson become emperor, because if they become emperor, there may have been a risk that they would have put a stop to Christianity. That's my thoughts on it, because if there's no reason on the surface why Hadrian changed his mind, that's the only reason that I can point to. But yeah, it was the Bar Kokhba War that he put down.
Okay. Sorry, what was that one more time?
Bar Kokhba.
Right.
You know that one? Yeah,
I recall it from. I recall the name, but you know, I mean, it's just like I said, the different the different names. Sometimes you can't remember what you're exactly thinking about.
Oh, I've got so many notes, I can't remember every.
Oh, I can imagine, man. Like, honestly, just reading your book, you go into a level of detail. You look at the languages in such a way that, I mean, like I said, I went to Bible school for 3 years, and I never put that much effort into it. But the good thing is, though, is when I went to Bible school, it did give me enough understanding of the Greek and the Hebrew.
I'll have to just stop for 1 second. I've just got to answer the door. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be back in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. No worries.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries, buddy. No worries. It's a good opportunity to kind of let the brain decompress.
Shove my earphones back in so I can hear you.
Oh, there you go. You good?
Yeah, yeah,
All
I can hear you. Yeah. Annoying blooming sales call.
Oh, no worries, man. No worries. Let's see here. So I think one thing that I wanted to try to see if I could figure out with you is a clear understanding of what the early process was in terms of the creation of the Gospels and how that was disseminated, to the population, or who was it that was first partaking in this? Was this something that was almost like a cult, where it was originally just kind of Piso and his family and friends taking part in this?
It would probably, from what I understand, again, I'm not going to sort of claim or say for certain that Gaius Plinius Secundus or Pliny the Younger was Paul, and that he had anything to do with it. But from what's been claimed, that's the case, that Pliny the Younger worked with Arius Piso and his sons when he'd grown up a bit, that could help. I believe that they would have been the ones that first either personally read the books to commoners or slaves, or they would have got slave scribes to read it out to the other slave scribes or other slaves and commoners, and that would have probably been, just from deduction, I don't think it would have been in Rome itself. It may have been in Herculaneum or Pompeii, because we know that the Piso family had a massive villa in Herculaneum. It's been excavated, part of it, but they can't go any further because there's buildings on top. But they know from when it was first discovered and when the archaeologists built tunnels into the villa, they found obviously a massive library of Greek scrolls and other learning. And there's a comment from from a paper, and it says it looks like when Vesuvius erupted, that the scrolls were kind of quickly moved. That was like their main goal, to move the scrolls. So my hypothesis or my conclusion for that is that they either went around Herculaneum and tested their new religion out to slaves and commoners, either there or in Pompeii, just to kind of get a feel for the reception, I guess.
Right.
Because at that point they wouldn't have known how it was going to be received.
This is where I start to look at Brian Muraresku's research and visualize in my mind how that might have looked like. If you had a guy holding a copy of the gospel or something of the sort, right? And you were encouraging people to come to your service or whatever it is that you were doing, like, maybe there was a somewhere outside, or who knows what they were doing. But if there was spiked wine, like if they were basically inviting people to their sacrament, to partake in their sacrament, and if people were familiar with the Dionysian traditions, they probably would have understood to some degree what they were getting themselves into. But if this was kind of this is kind of how I'm visualizing it, is that they were inviting people into these guided meditations or guided trips or something of the sort, right? Like a church service of some sort, where you got somebody who's reading the gospel and they're reading the words of Jesus or something like that, and everybody's taking the sacrament, they're taking the wine, and as they're starting to, you know, trip, and they're listening to the words that are being told them, then I can see how for some people maybe this would have actually been very exciting. You know, a new religion on the block. You know, it's similar, but then for a lot of people though as well, they probably would have seen no use for it, right? They would have been like, I don't, you know what I mean? I'm just going to go to the Dionysian temple and keep doing my thing, right? So
exactly.
It's not until 300 years later with Constantine that maybe you really start seeing a push to transform these pagan temples into Christian temples, and and that's kind of the history of Christianity, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from the evidence, it doesn't look like the current narrative of them being destroyed, like the pagan temples being destroyed and things like that being destroyed by Constantine to make Christianity, you know, the religion. There doesn't seem to be any archaeological evidence for that, which is fine. It seems then that that then supports the kind of subtle political agenda of Constantine. So if, like you say, you know, like 300 years later, when it sort of starts to kind of gain steam, forcing people to accept a religion, I believe wasn't it wasn't a thing back then. So I can see that what Constantine would have possibly done, or what he would have thought of, which mirrors today's politics, is like a subtle change. So destroying pagan temples would have done nothing but anger people that were still following the pagan cults.
Sure.
So instead,
I don't think it was a destruction as much as a renovation.
Yeah, they kind of renovate. I mean, I know a lot of people have said that Christians went around destroying thousands of temples and whatnot, but there's literally there's no evidence for that.
Is there not? There's not evidence that, like, because what I recall hearing, anyways, is that there were, you know, temples devoted to Mithras that were then changed to be Christian, or
they might have like sort of changed what they were used for, but the narrative that seems to go around is that they were like, you know, like just dismantled or destroyed. The actual physical pagan temples were destroyed, but that's not the case. Like you said, they were reappropriated.
Right.
And
a lot of these old churches, right? You peel back some of the layers and you're looking at pagan symbols and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. And what seems to have been the case is that.
And isn't that such a great indication of like what Christianity is? You know what I mean? Like, if you want to understand what it is, like, just look at that right there. And that is, it's a renovation of religion.
Yeah. Well, there's no, from what I've seen, there's no religion that's original except for the sort of the religions way back. You know, especially the sort of the religions that we know of and familiar with. They're not original. But with Constantine, it would be a fact of stopping the financial support for the pagan cults and gently easing the money away from the pagan temples over a process of time, and then so that, you know, there was no reason for the Roman elite to sponsor those religions because it was no benefit for them. They weren't getting any money from it. So then it's a kind of shift from pagan, gently shifting into Christianity. Constantine putting in the infrastructure for the churches, as we see like churches cropping up, and then and then
there's I can't recall the details, but I can't remember who the researcher was, but I recall reading a book or watching a documentary, and it was talking about a previous. I think it was maybe talking about the story of Moses and how the story of Moses was made, and that it coincides with the changing of the age, and that the true story of the Moses story actually has to do with a pharaoh, and that at the changing of the age, there was the pharaoh's son wanted to create a new religion that was in honor of the new age, and that created a rift that eventually he was exiled. And again, I don't remember all the details here, but I do think that there's an interesting parallel between that and what you're looking at here, because if you want to look at one of the motivations for why Piso would have wanted to create a new religion, it might have been something to do with that, because that around that time, astrologically speaking, is also the changing of the age. And so that might have been somewhat of the impetus, right? Some of the inspiration of like, oh, you know, a new age is changing. We need a new religion for the new age. And
but if you think about it, I mean, with the Egyptian pharaohs, we hear of the Egyptians kind of from Egypt into settling into Judea. So if the Egyptian pharaohs created a new religion and then, you know, brought it into Judea, and we find that the Calpurnius Piso, Herodians and Flavians are descendants of those, you know, the Jewish royalty, then really what you have is what they had was a sort of a blueprint of how to create religion, and how to make it work.
100%.
Not saying that it's going to happen overnight, because obviously Judaism was so strong, but they had the blueprint there. So it kind of links again.
That's what I think is really hard to wrap your head around if you really haven't thought about this much, and if you're very steeped in you know, the fundamental traditions, is the intellectualism of people at this time. I think it's easy to assume that people were not that smart, or not as smart as they are today. And I think that what this reveals is that no, you know, like 2,000 years ago, people were really freaking smart. There were some really smart people out there doing some really incredible things, incredible architecture.
Particularly in the elite level, I mean, the literary levels, you know, speaking or writing, were very low. I think it's Jewish professor Catherine Hetzer, I think I pronounced the name right, presents information about that. But I mean, ancient Roman royalty, it's known that the ancient royals sent their children off to over here to the UK to be taught by the Druids, and the Druids had the knowledge, and we know that the Romans killed off the Druids. There's information available. And so what would the Romans do when they killed the Druids off that they'd been learning from? Take their information and use it for themselves.
And this is what empires do, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's it's something that's pretty common, and you know, you look at even the Bible when it talks about the Jewish people taken into Babylonian captivity. It talks specifically about how they took the best and brightest, and it's a common thing when one nation conquers another. It's like, we want all your best stuff now. we want your smartest people. We want all your books. We want all your, and that I think is what we're looking at here when we're looking at Piso. Is we're looking at an individual who, again, correct me if I'm wrong, in addition to having a military career, which is fairly common for Roman royalty. He also appeared to be an academic, like, in, you know, I think he, you know, he might have been the tip of the spear, but but I kind of wonder about the interactions that he's having with other people and the information that he is compiling over a period of time, and the conversations that he's having, right? Because you're talking about how he's related to the Herodians.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're talking about somebody who has already one foot in the Roman traditions, which are connected to the Greek traditions, which are connected to the, you know, Egyptian traditions, etc. Yeah. And then you've got him related to these individuals who are very steeped in the Jewish traditions, right? Right. And Jewish mysticism, I mean, it seems as though it was just very, very popular. Like even now, right? If you look at Kabbalah and that's one of the things that I found interesting as a Christian, and kind of moving away from that and looking at Judaism, realizing how stripped down Christianity is in relationship to Judaism. Judaism is very, it's almost scientific or mathematical or something. It's like a form of spirituality that's based on, you know, the different vowels and numerology, and so these people would have been very versed in all of those things, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, the Greeks had the writer known as Plutarch, which again evidence shows that wasn't the real person. In his work, we have a thing called Hous3ofThis. I think that's what it's called, and it's basically a game of using numbers to create names. So we have examples of it being used, and I think that's one of the things that's confused me, is that we know these different things were used, and we have other examples that aren't linked to Christianity, but they're being used at the time. And for me, it baffles me a little bit that when numerology is mentioned in the Bible concerning this information, it's sneered at, or it's called, you know, called whatever names. But if you, I don't know, for example, with Nero being depicted as the beast, right. And you know, saying that his name, Caesar or Kaiser Neron, is presented in 666. Now, that's fair enough, but when new information comes to light, as has come to light at the moment, that at the time when we think about Christianity, the understanding of Christianity at the moment is that Nero wouldn't have known anything really about Christians. A Christian religion wouldn't have been separated from Judaism if we're thinking about the current understanding of it.
Sure.
So when we look at that, and we see that Nero couldn't really have been a beast because of the way he seems to have been a man of peace, then it kind of gets stripped away. But then again, if you go back to the Flavians, Herodians, Pisos, when you realize that you look at the number 666 again, and even 616, that it spells out the name Christ Flavius Josephus, and it doesn't even take a lot of work to create that name out of those numbers. And when you mention that to people and you say, well, Flavius Josephus is in the right context and relevant to the subject, I think I spoke to one person, he was religious, and he came back with a remark, well, you know, Barney the dinosaur can be made into 666. And I was like, yes, but I'm pretty sure Bonnie the dinosaur wasn't alive at that period. You know, it wasn't a thing. So it's like it's a bit of a silly argument. But when you kind of sort of say that and people sort of reject it, I'm like, well, why? Why would you reject it? We know that this guy who called himself Flavius Josephus is linked to the New Testament. And then they say, well, we can't make Josephus's name out of 666. It doesn't compute to that. And I say, well, when you think of it from the Latin perspective of the Roman elite, the Latins in Latin, there's no symbol for zero. They didn't have a zero. It was the word pneuma, I think is the correct one. And so if they are writing and they're thinking about it in Greek, which did have zero, then they can easily take the zeros away, present a name for themselves, thinking in Greek, but, you know, sort of thinking between the two languages. There's absolutely nothing to stop them from doing that. And I suppose there's things like that I don't know. I wonder why it's not been looked at before.
Well, again, I think like my brain goes back to the fact that English distorts a certain amount of the meaning. And unless you can sort of put yourself in the shoes of somebody who, like you're saying, is of a Latin background, but understands Greek and understands Aramaic and Hebrew and like understands the interplay between the languages. You know, I'm a bilingual person, so I can there's when you're bilingual, there's like you can understand certain nuances, and there's even jokes, right? Like that's kind of one of the things I think you point out in your book is that if you understand the context, then there's like these little jokes that are in there, but you have to understand Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and numerology, and like, you know what I mean, to get the joke, you know.
Well, you kind of have to know that's what's going on. Right. If you don't know that that's what's going on in the first place, you're not going to be looking for it.
Yeah.
You know. You have to have a starting point. Yeah.
The starting point, I think, for from one person to another is either going to be I believe this or I don't. And I know that for anybody who already believes it, to change from that place to I don't believe it is an incredibly difficult shift to make. And psychologically speaking, like, I mean, the transition I made was over a period of years. If all of a sudden, if you were to take 20-year-old me and suddenly download all of this information into my brain, I might have like a psychological breakdown. You know what I mean? Like
aneurysm.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like my brain would just be like, and I think there would be trauma. Like I feel traumatized already, to be honest with you. But it's like a slow trauma, you know what I mean? Because it's like a slow waking realization of like, oh man, like I spent however many years just being hoodwinked by this whole thing. But I've been trying to be more compassionate with myself and try to understand it and be like, it's not that you're stupid. It's just that's the lot that you were given in life, and you do the best that you can, and there's something to learn from it, right?
I suppose I've got an advantage in the fact that I've never been religious. I've never had anything against religion per se, and my interest has been purely historical. But I think that if people read the book and read the information on the website, and then that's right.
Good.
If people read the information that I presented and they feel stupid for being hoodwinked by it, I don't think that they should, because really you know, unless you're educated to the level that the elites were educated to, then you're not gonna know about these things. I mean, like I said, we have corruption in politics at the moment. We know we do. And there's things that we don't know going on in politics that we have no idea about. And, you know, I mean, throughout history during the war, there's been propaganda to get people to believe a certain thing and to act a certain way. So unless people are given the information and given the education as they're growing up about how these things work, how words work, how letters work, and whatnot, then they're not going to know it. And so there's no point feeling stupid. I mean, you should feel peed off, really, that the education system's been so poor. Because, you know, the general education system, especially over here in the UK, is a fairly recent thing. And it's still, you know, when I look at it, I mean, I've got a little boy, and when I look at the work he's doing, I think, well, you know, I've worked in various places, and I can see that the level of education that I had and my little boy's getting is below the level of education that people at, say, Oxford or Eton or you know, private colleges get. So there's no point feeling stupid, because it you know, I say philanger. I mean, people can feel what they want, but, you know, if you're not taught it and if you don't know what's happening, then it's no one's fault. I mean, this is for this to change people's minds and for it to change academia, because this is quite controversial and quite a massive information and quite big. I think it will take a long time to change the way people think, because an example I can give is the Historia Augusta. I don't know whether you're aware of it. It's basically a collection of biographies that is said to be composed by 6 people at different times under the rule of Diocletian and Constantine. But until the year 1889, I think it was, Herman Dessau, he basically stated that a single author had written it at a date towards the end of the 4th century. And so it kind of it was contested a lot by authority and people in scholarship. They didn't like it because it was going against what they viewed as correct, and it took long years to gain recognition. And you know, the eminent late historian Sir Ronald Syme did a huge amount of work on it. And in my view, if the Historia Augusta, which isn't as controversial as this, took long years to gain recognition, and I can imagine this is going to take even longer. So, you know, I think I'll probably be in my 90s by the time academia accepts it. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is the waking realization that I've had, right? The more that I've moved away from fundamentalism and tried to see things from a different perspective, an informed perspective, the more that I've you kind of have to deal with the loneliness, I guess, the realization of like, okay, well, I know this now, but but I still live in a world where this stuff is baked into the pie. But I really like what you're saying, because I think that's an important point that I'd like to get across to anybody who's listening, is that, again, the information we're going through here, this is not about attacking anybody or calling anybody stupid or, you know, whatever, diminishing anybody's intelligence. Rather, it's really about exposing a truth that says so much about who we are as humans. And I think for myself, one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this is because I feel for myself that the more that I gain clarity in my life, the more that it helps me deal with my own anxieties and uncertainties and stuff. And a certain amount of that comes from the fact that for 20 years, I was very deeply involved in this belief system. And now I'm at a point to where I can see how that belief system functions in the world and the effect that it has. And because I was a part of it for so long, I'm critical of it and concerned about how it will impact the world, how it has impacted the world. And it's one of the things that I concern myself with is just sort of as a Christian growing up in the church and just kind of realizing how there is sort of this fulfilling prophecy that's at work within Christianity that has to do with certain beliefs that are baked into the belief system. One of those being, like I said before, how there's a belief that there's an inherent evil in the physical world, and that the physical world is doomed to destruction. And I think that this belief feeds into our current problem with climate change. I think that a certain amount of people are irresponsible because they feel like they don't have anything to worry about. The world's going to go to hell in a handbasket anyway. So why not even get it there faster so that way Jesus shows up sooner? There's a kind of twisted mentality kind of baked in there. And not everybody shares it. It's not overt, but when you kind of see it at play, in kind of its larger, more violent forms, that's where, for me, I've really had to take a step back and do some soul searching in all of this. And it's interestingly enough, when I consider my own relationship to Christ, the idea of Christ growing up in church and just, how I related to that, it's the idea of, I think, trying to be a better person, trying to, you're sort of piggybacking on the Son of God in order to try to be a better person. But I feel like I'm at a point in my life where I definitely understand the need to take personal responsibility and realize that, whatever you believe, you have to take responsibility for your life, your actions, and the choices that you make, and whether you attach religion to that or not. We're all sort of in a similar situation, and that is, we want to try to live the best lives that we can possible. And I think for me, part of that process has been trying to understand Christianity and try to understand my relationship to it, the effect that it's had on me, negative and positive, and also the effect that it's had on the world at large, for negative and positive. And that's something that I have wrestled with more so as I've realized the imperialistic thrust of Christianity and how often the gospel has really just been used as an excuse to go in and take other people's stuff and kill them if they don't agree with you, so it's like, So I mean, it's in a sort of, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'm agreeing with you. I think there seems to be a kind of a sort of freeway kind of conflict. Is like, one, you have people wrestling, like yourself, wrestling with their faith and coming out of their faith, and realizing, taking responsibility. And then you have the religious wrestling with sort of those that describe themselves as atheists, arguing back and forth. But then you have arguments between atheists as well, which I don't understand when this information is removed. I don't understand why atheists are arguing between themselves. That makes no sense. But when you bring this information in, I can understand why. I mean, there's a few people that class themselves as atheists, and say that an elite authorship is widely known within academics or academia. And then on the other hand, you have someone saying that a notion like that, that the oral tradition is gone and it's just elite authors, is a radical idea. So it's like, so which one is it? Is it, do scholars know that the elites wrote the New Testament, or is it a radical idea? Now, it must be a new idea because I said in my book on the website that, there's now a publication out, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, by Robin Faith Walsh. And she argues for an elite authorship of the Synoptic Gospels, based on the evidence we have from literary capabilities and who would have had the means to create it. So it can't, in my mind, it can't be accepted within academia yet, because why would a professor bring out a new book and it be regarded as a radical idea? And I think the people that think it's a radical idea, and tying into this is the existence of Jesus. I believe that people don't believe Jesus exists, are called mythicists or whatnot. I can see why they would call people mythicists, because why bring in the name of the location as Nazareth if Nazareth didn't exist? Because it is a problem, because the Messiah is meant to be born in Bethlehem. So why did he come from Nazareth? And there's a whole load of things in there. But I think the people that say that it is a valid argument, and I understand it, but I don't. Those people, I think, have either knowledge or read up on the parallels between the Roman campaign and the ministry of Jesus, and think it's all hogwash or whatever. And I think that's the reason. If they read it and they know it exists, but they think it's rubbish, they're going to think that yes, this Jesus guy existed. But if you read it, and I think the way Atwill presented it wasn't to my taste, but I understood it. So I've tried to kind of bring it back a level and just not make it so excitable, and just make it more sober. When you actually,
I understand what you mean by that.
Yeah. When you look at all the evidence and you look at you go right into it, you can see that the ministry of Jesus parallels the military campaign of
I think that's what people would have such a hard time with. Like, I mean, like, people have such a in their mind, most people have an idea of Jesus as being a pacifist, as being like, loving and healing and people and all that. So the idea of Jesus being a trick, like here you go, here we're gonna make this nice pretty thing that looks really sweet and says he loves you and all that, but the reality is, I mean, is something dark to such a degree that I think it would really be disturbing for most people to really kind of wrap their head around it. And I think
that's why you can't force this on people. People have got to want to learn about it from their own will.
I think for me, like, what sobered me up, you might say, was just, there's a saying like, actions speak louder than words, right? So when you look at the actions of the Christian church, when you look at how it has functioned over 2,000 years, actions speak louder than words. So that to me is the disturbing part of Christian history that every Christian, I think, doesn't want to admit, but the reality is that Christianity has time and time again been responsible for violence, conquest. It's very easy when you have one group of people who feel like they have a mandate from God. They have superior military, and the mentality is, you're going to go to hell anyways. Let me just send you there faster.
Yeah.
That is how it actually manifests. And very often people of good intentions, unfortunately, they are manipulated, and oftentimes are willingly, allow themselves to do so, so that people in power and can perform military operations and do things in the name of Christ. That is very dark, like it's a dark aspect of our humanity that is very, very difficult, I think, for anybody to untangle. Like, just for example, anybody who lives in the States and is heavily invested in fundamental Christianity, and is also very nationalistic as an American as well. I own my gun and I've got my Bible, and there's so much invested there, that to try to convince somebody that, hey, you're actually a part of a dark history of violence and conquest. And people don't necessarily want to connect themselves to that, right? They don't want to feel like they're responsible for it. And they don't want to feel like they're perpetuating it either. Is, we can gotta go into like critical race theory and all that kind of stuff, but I think that's kind of what's at stake here in all of this conversation. Really just has to do with, like, what is the truth, and how can we actually govern our lives from a place of truth and understanding, as opposed to having the truth concealed from us. And we have to be constantly making decisions from that place, a place of confusion, a place of, like, not entirely understanding everything that's going on, and having this sort of fog that's constantly present. And I would say that that's how I would describe being a Christian, being involved in church. And what my eventual frustration was, is I just looked around at the world and I saw that the world was operating a certain way, that the rules of my religion, they helped me to some degree, but in other degrees they were hindering me dramatically. And what I would say is just kind of like an intellectual block. It's just like, there's only so far you can go, because at some point you can't go any further, because you're holding on to these beliefs so tightly, and you don't want to let them go, because I think it's terrifying. I think people, they're terrified to let go of, like, what if I let go of the idea of being an American, and and God's on my side, and God loves America better than everybody else, like that. I think is, to some degree, is terrifying, because ultimately what it is, it's a metaphor for the power and the privilege of being an American, and being in that position of, like, I'm picking on Americans right now, sorry, for anybody who's American listening, but I'm just using it as an example. You know what I mean? I'm sort of showing how we as human beings, we will latch on to whatever idea, because it gives us power, I think, a lot of times. And so if we're talking about atheists and comparing atheists, you know what I mean, I think atheists, that's kind of maybe what it comes down to, is sometimes it's the power of being right. And so that's where the conflict might come in. It's like, well, I'm right and you're right, or I'm right and you're wrong, and that
there's a certain arrogance.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's my biggest. That's always been my biggest issue when becoming more of a skeptic and moving more in a direction of atheism, is a lot of times I find atheists somewhat distasteful. Not all of them, but I think there's a certain amount of anger there's with a lot of atheists, you know what I mean? And I understand it, because you're living in a world where you feel like you're just living in a crazy world, right?
You certainly get it on social media. Definitely. I mean, I try not to get involved in it too much, because I just, I've got more important things to do. But I mean, if someone tags me in a tweet or whatever it is, and is not stupid, then I'll reply back if I've got time. I mean, sometimes I forget, but I've got into a few arguments on Twitter before, and I just, it, I kind of just, I take a quote from Winston Churchill, love him or hate him. You know, if you stop to bark at every dog that barks at you, you'll never get anything done. So
Yeah. Sure.
I can't be bothered. I'd rather just get research done, put it out there, and you know, not have the stress of someone criticizing me on social media. If they want to criticize me, criticize me. If you want to check out the information for yourself, check out the information for yourself, and you know, verify it for yourself or debunk it for yourself. It doesn't bother me because I feel I've done a good job and the evidence is there. I'm not going to force it down people's throats. So, you know, because that doesn't work. Well, it does for some organizations.
Well, I think sometimes, you know, there's the risk of preaching to the crowd. And when you have something that's worth saying, then it's got to be something that even your detractors should you know, question themselves and kind of say, okay, maybe this guy's got something to say, right? But if you're putting up blockades and casting aspersions, then you're, to some degree, you're not opening the door for people to accept the information that you're presenting, right? So I really appreciate. I think we're kind of winding down here, so I want to just tell you.
Pick up my little boy in a minute, anyway.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. But you know, like, I just want to say to you, man. First of all, thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it.
I'm glad you did, and I was, you know what I mean? You don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but just for myself, what I wanted to get out of this conversation, I absolutely did, and I really appreciate that you're willing to do this, and I appreciate who you are as a person, and that you know, you don't seem to have any axes to grind. You're just looking at the data and putting it out and allowing people to make up their own minds about it, and I respect that, and I'd say for myself that just the opportunity to have a conversation like this and put to rest some of my own questions and curiosities that just kind of linger in the back of your mind, the opportunity to kind of set some stuff straight with someone like you is really a joy for me, and I hope that other people get something out of this. Man, just thank you so much.
Well, for me, it's good to talk to people like yourself, because it gives me it gives me a different perspective on, you know, the way people are thinking about certain things, so I can kind of, you know kind of what research to tackle, what's confusing people, and see if I can, you know, discover new things to help that out, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So, you know, it's always good to have different perspectives, not just your own.
Well, can I say, man, that I loved your first book, and I will tell you that when you put out your next book, I'm that much more excited for it. I'm
not sure when it'll be yet, but
I'm not. You know, it might not be next week or whatever, but just
the pressure's on now.
Well, you know, I know that doing something like you did, and just going into that, I mean, everything that's in this book, it's not a super long book, but just there's so much jam-packed in it, so much information that's just one rabbit hole after another. And I know that it to some degree, it's almost like flinging paint on the wall and just hoping that it looks like something, you know, looks like art, right? But the opportunity to put this out and get other perspectives and just kind of see where things go. That's why I say that I'm looking forward to whatever comes next, and I'm going to keep on paying attention to your YouTube channel and the stuff that you're putting out. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And we're going to just, for anybody who's listening, any links to Henry's content or anything that we've talked about during this podcast, I'll put those in the comments. And by all means, you know, share this far and wide. This is something that I'm really proud to finally be able to kind of take a lot of the information that I've been sitting on and have a conversation with someone like Henry and share that conversation with you. So I'm really hoping that this just opens doors to more discussion. And at the end of the day, this is about bringing people together and not tearing people apart.
So
Henry, thank you so much, man.
I'll just say to end that I know that people have asked if my book's going to be peer reviewed with an academia, and I've submitted it to a New Testament journal, and they have criteria that they look for before sending a book out to make sure it's, you know, professionally written and accurate. And, you know, I'm pleased to say that it looks to have passed that criteria. So it's been offered out for you know, a peer review. So hopefully I get something back from that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. That's exciting stuff. Yeah, you've decided to go after something, man. I respect it. I respect the work that you've done. It's just you know what I love about it is it's like looking at like a mess, and you're just like, I don't know where to start, and I don't want to, you know what I mean? And then you come back, and then somebody else has come and they've cleaned it up and organized it, and you're like, oh, dude, thank you so much. Like, that's how I feel right now. So, yeah. So like,
definitely,
you know,
I've got a prescription to aspirin, that's for sure.
Yeah. No, man, thank you so much. I hope in the future we can maybe have another conversation, do a follow up to what we did here. And yeah, if anybody wants to follow Henry, you can find him on YouTube, subscribe to him there. And of course, get his book, Creating Christianity. I think I got mine on Amazon. So yeah. Henry,
thanks for having me, and good luck with everything.
You rock, man. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for listening. All right, we'll just say bye there. I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop.